When you hear of the Middle Ages, what do you imagine? A time long ago when lords and ladies lived in fantastic castles? And knights in armor roamed the countryside? When enormous cathedrals towered over the villages? And peasants worked in the fields? It seems like a fairy tale world to us now, but it really happened. And although the voices of the people who lived in those times are now silent, the buildings and works of art they left behind can tell a fascinating story of what life was like in the Middle Ages. Our story takes place here in the fertile farmlands near the west coast of England. For centuries, these lands were home to Celtic-speaking people called the Welsh, who lived in the Kingdom of Wales. The Welsh fought hard to protect their lands, first from the Romans and later from the Anglo-Saxons. Then, when England was conquered by William, the Duke of Normandy, at the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the Welsh faced a new enemy, as some of the Welsh homelands were divided among the Norman invaders. The Normans brought with them the medieval culture and architecture of their French homeland, and soon the countryside rang out with the sounds of the mason's chisel as great stone castles, abbeys, and cathedrals were constructed, some taking hundreds of years to complete. The first great fortress to be built following the Norman conquest was Chepstow Castle. From its protected vantage point high on the cliffs above the River Wye, the lords and ladies could keep an eye on everyone who traveled the coastal road between England and Wales, and they could defend themselves against attack by the enemy Welsh. A village soon grew up under the protection of the castle, the villagers working in the lord's fields or as servants in the castle. Then, 65 years after construction began on Chepstow Castle, the Lord brought monks over from Normandy to establish a great church at Tintern, 5 miles up the Wye River. At the same time, a Norman knight began to build his own smaller castle on the lands of Penhow, 8 miles west of Chepstow. Together, Chepstow Castle, the surrounding village, Tintern Abbey, and the Knight's Castle of Penhow formed a complete medieval society based on the principles of feudalism, which governed how people lived and worked and what they believed. Everyone's place in this society was strictly defined. Lords and ladies, servants and craftsmen, knights and monks, all had their roles in feudal society. Feudalism was based on the service of a vassal to his lord in exchange for protection and the right to live on his land. The feudal nobility formed the top of a social pyramid, whose tip was composed of royalty, the kings, queens, princes, and princesses who ruled over entire countries. Lower in rank were the dukes, earls, barons, and other lesser nobles who controlled vast regions within the king's domain. In exchange, they provided him with armies and treasure. Smaller landholders formed the center of the social pyramid. Quite often, these small landholders were knights in the service of earls and other nobles. At the pyramid's base were huge masses of serfs, the landless, unpaid laborers who dwelt in villages and worked the land for a share of the crops they raised. The castles of 900 years ago were not just fortresses, they were also the homes of noblemen and their families. A great castle was like a small self-contained town. Inside its walls you could find almost everything you wanted. It took lots of work and many people to keep the castle running smoothly. One large English castle records employing 300 full-time servants. Like most medieval fortresses, Chepstow Castle was constructed in stages over many centuries. Chepstow began as a single great stone tower. Life in this tower was difficult, but these Norman invaders were a tough and determined group. Their main concern was just to survive in the midst of a very hostile environment. It was cold inside this tower, which was built without a fireplace. The only warmth was provided by portable braziers filled with burning coals. Most of the Lord's day-to-day social, administrative, and military duties were performed inside the tower within this great hall. Meals were served here, and each day the servants made up dining tables by placing thick boards on wooden trestles. The early Normans were not used to having much privacy, for at night the tables were simply put away and the Lord, his family, guests, and dogs curled up on the floor and went to sleep. Starting in 1270, as war raged between the kingdoms of Wales and England, the Lord of Chepstow Castle decided to make his home more comfortable, and construction began on a new hall, kitchens, pantries, cellars, and living quarters. Because some of these rooms are in ruins today, we can only imagine how they must have looked over 700 years ago. But we can get some impression of their appearance by looking at rooms serving similar purposes at nearby Penhow Castle. Here, the dining table stands in the castle's great hall, beneath a ceiling supported by heavy oak beams, overlooked by a minstrel's gallery where musicians performed during many lavish banquets. The nobles ate 2 hot meals a day. They feasted on wild game and a variety of strong, spicy foods. At Chepstow Castle, food was prepared in a large kitchen building separate from the hall. For the kitchen was a smoky place where a big open fire always blazed, meat roasted, kettles boiled, and endless loaves of bread were baked in ovens along the kitchen wall. Because hundreds of people lived in large castles, quite a few rooms were dedicated to food preparation and storage. Beneath the great dining hall at Chepstow are cellars where food was stored after being hoisted up from boats in the river below. Nearby is a buttery where wine and beer were stored, and the butler kept track of the castle account books. Also, beneath the hall is a pantry for final food preparation, and stone cupboards where knives and table linens were kept. Across the courtyard from the kitchens and dining hall, a new tower was constructed to shelter the late 13th century lords of Chepstow Castle. It is a massive structure when seen from outside the curtain walls, showing clearly the huge pyramids of stone employed to protect it from attack by the battering ram. To reach the bedchambers within the tower, the noble lords, ladies, and their children climbed a steep, winding staircase. Their bedchambers may once have resembled this room at Penhow Castle, with a large bed, a small child's bed, and a chest for clothing. In a room just like this, a nobleman could sit in his window seat and survey his domain in safety. On cold winter days, many lords conducted castle business from their bedchambers, enjoying the warmth of the fireplace in an otherwise cold and drafty building. The nobility loved to show off their riches, not only by constructing enormous castles, but also by wearing the elegant clothing which set them apart from the common people. In the late medieval era, the nobles passed sumptuary laws, which forbid even the wealthiest commoners from wearing lavish clothing. The nobles reserved the most ornate styles for their class alone. Dressed in their finery, lords and ladies spent a good deal of time in the pursuit of pleasure, attending mock battles, feasting, and hunting rabbits or other small game with falcons especially trained for this purpose. Noblemen were not the only people who owned castles. The Lord of Chepstow granted the lands of Penhow Castle to one of his loyal Norman knights for a knight's fee, that is, in exchange for keeping the Welsh subdued, providing a monthly quota of men to serve at Chepstow Castle, and supplying one mounted soldier in times of war. A knight's position in society required him to be both a military man and landowner. As a landowner, it was his duty to oversee the smooth operation of his farms and village. Yet knights, like all other wealthy members of medieval society, were forced to raise their families behind thick castle walls, for these were dangerous times. In the Middle Ages, the nobility made the major military decisions, ordering knights and soldiers into battle. Some were even sent on crusades, traveling thousands of miles to fight the Muslims who occupied the holy sites of Christianity. Knights were distinguished from common soldiers because they fought on horseback. It cost a great deal of money to be a knight. A war horse, shield, and armor cost as much as a poor farm worker could earn in 100 years. In the field of battle, a knight on horseback had the advantage over the foot soldier. He was faster, had better armor, and superior training. But even fully armored knights could not withstand a steady shower of arrows unleashed from behind castle walls. From high above, archers shot down at attackers through the gaps in the tower walls. And they could move safely along the wall walks to reach special arrow slits. Most castles were surrounded by water-filled moats. In times of war, the drawbridge was raised. A powerful grate was dropped, and the castle doors were locked behind both of them. Even if attackers could get close enough to chop through the doors, they were still vulnerable to arrows, rocks, and boiling oil streaming through murder holes above the castle's entrance. Captured attackers met horrible fates. They were locked up in cold, windowless dungeons. Here they often underwent gruesome ordeals. In addition to the safety provided by the castle itself, armor offered further protection to knights in battle. In the early Middle Ages, armor constructed of many tiny loops of metal called chainmail protected men from arrows shot from longbows. However, with the invention of the powerful crossbow, armorers abandoned chainmail for stronger suits made of metal plates. These heavy outfits provided excellent protection, but were extremely hot and difficult to move about in. And a knight who was knocked off his horse in battle had little hope of getting up without assistance. From the 12th to the 14th centuries, mock battles or tournaments were a favorite form of entertainment at castles. These grand spectacles were an excellent way for knights to practice for real warfare. And although tournaments were played with blunted weapons, they could still be very dangerous games. When knights fought in teams, the event was called a melee. But if knights competed one-on-one, it was called a joust. In medieval times, every upper-class family had a coat of arms. These were proudly displayed at tournaments on shields and banners. Coats of arms contained important symbols reflecting family heritage. Even the clergy possessed coats of arms like these of the bishops of Gloucester. Training for knighthood began at the age of 8 when a boy from a noble family became a page. This first stage of his education focused on horsemanship, chess, falconry, reading, writing, and good manners. The page became a squire as he entered his teens, serving at his master's side in battle. When his training was completed, an elaborate ritual was performed, and with the tap of a sword, the squire was transformed into a young knight. Knighthood was a source of tremendous pride and power, but sometimes this power was abused, and members of the lower classes were badly mistreated. Yet knighthood often brought great glory. And to this day, every large European church holds the tombs of these ancient warriors. Clad in armor even in death, they act as silent reminders of a long-vanished age. Religion played a very important role in the lives of people during the Middle Ages. While not everyone was a sincere believer, the power of the Roman Catholic Church over people's lives far exceeded that of any worldly king. Nearly every village had a small church whose priest was just as poor as the members of his flock. The priest said daily masses and performed the holy sacraments which marked the passing of each stage of life. The church strictly regulated people's behavior in medieval times. Rich and poor alike were taught the consequences of their deeds. The vivid artwork of the churches offered glimpses into the unbearable suffering of hell and the unimaginable bliss of heaven. The Middle Ages was a time of magic and mystery, but most people were illiterate. The priest was often the only person in the village who could read and write. The church was the only institution of the age which supported education. The two oldest English universities, Cambridge and Oxford, were both founded by the church over 8 centuries ago. In the Middle Ages, every family was expected to donate 10% of their income to the church. These tithes, as they were called, were collected from the villagers at harvest time, when 1/10 of their crops were taken to church-owned tithe barns, like this one, before being sold. As a result of this practice, the church became very wealthy. Enormous, ornate churches called cathedrals were built in most major towns to serve as centers of church administration. One town competed with another to see which could create the most lavish building. These magnificent structures required the labor of hundreds of men and many centuries to complete. Cathedrals were the homes of high-ranking priests of the church, called bishops. These men controlled the church's wealth and oversaw the activities of hundreds of parish priests. Bishops were social equals to noblemen, and like them, lived in splendid palaces. Although there were many good bishops, some were corrupted by the wealth they controlled. Bishops sometimes became objects of scorn to the impoverished villagers who saw their hard-earned tithes wasted on decorations instead of being used to save souls. The Protestant Reformation, which began in Europe near the end of the 15th century, started as a reaction to the worldliness of the church. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church had become increasingly involved in struggles for power with the nobility. As a result, in the 1530s, England's King Henry VIII decreed himself leader of the Church of England and ordered all the monasteries in his realm to be closed forever. Their treasures became the property of the king, and their leaden roofs were sold for scrap. This monastery, called Tintern Abbey, lies only 5 miles up the Wye River from Chepstow Castle. The foundation stones of this abbey were laid down only 65 years after the Norman conquest. The money for this enormous project was provided by the Lord of Chepstow Castle himself. Such extravagance was not unusual in the Middle Ages, for these acts of piety were thought to spiritually benefit the donors, who hoped that gifts to the church might help clear their ways on the path to heaven. While cathedrals were town-based administrative centers of the church, monasteries were rural centers of intense religious practice, where communities of either monks or nuns lived in isolation, cut off from all worldly influences. On this spot, for over 500 years, untold numbers of men spent their entire adult lives in quiet seclusion, following strict rules designed to bring them closer to God. Like Chepstow Castle, Tintern Abbey depended on the produce of its lands for most of its income. And, although the monks performed some of the labor in the fields, most was carried out by the lay brothers, poor, illiterate men who arrived in surprising numbers at the monastery gates, seeking food and shelter. The fully trained monks, called choir monks, shared the monastery with the lay brothers, but occupied separate areas for worship, sleeping, and eating. Most of Tintern Abbey lies in total ruin, but a nearby cathedral, which was once a monastery, still retains important structures lost at Tintern. All monasteries had cloisters, which are covered walkways surrounding a central garden that connect most of the monastery buildings. Centuries ago, they were the site of a lot of daily activity. Here monks read the scriptures as they walked along, studied in compartments along the outer wall, listened to the abbot teach, and washed their hands in the lavatorium before eating their 2 simple daily meals. Near the lavatorium were dining halls, dormitories, and the warming house, which was the only place, other than the kitchen and hospital, where a fire was allowed to burn. Here the monks could restore the circulation to their bodies after hours in the freezing church. Choir monks offered their entire lives as a sacrifice to God. Their day began at 2 a.m., when they formed a candle-lit procession, entering the church by special stairs leading from their dormitories. By the time the first rays of light passed through the stained glass windows, many hours of the day had already been spent in darkness. Throughout the day, hours of worship alternated with periods of study, until finally, after sunset, the last prayers were said and the monks were freed to return to their beds to sleep. While the lives led by the monks of Tintern Abbey were hard and tiring, so were those of the serfs who farmed the fields. There were more serfs 1,000 years ago than all the other social classes combined. The serfs owned no land. Instead, they farmed long strips within great fields belonging to their masters. They were allowed to keep most of their produce. The church, however, took its share in tithes, and the landlord required a certain number of days' labor each week in his fields. The serfs dwelt in small villages, which often grew up within sight of a castle. In times of danger, the serfs could seek safety behind the castle walls. Because the lord of the castle provided the serfs both with protection and with the land to work, the serfs were said to be bound to the land. If the land was sold, the serfs were sold with it. Like all large medieval land holdings, those belonging to Chepstow Castle and Tintern Abbey were subdivided into smaller units called manors. A typical manor consisted of a fortified house, a church, a village, and a few farms. The lord of the manor could be a knight, son, brother, or uncle of the lord of the castle. Manor villages were separated by many miles of rough road through dark forests. News traveled slowly, and as a result, the villagers' world seemed small. Most serfs rarely traveled beyond the borders of their manor lands. Villages were self-sufficient, producing everything they needed, from food to clothing to furniture. Village women in the Middle Ages helped in the fields, but because they were often pregnant or looking after children, their work focused on life at home. Women sewed clothing, cooked, mended, tended the fire, and preserved food, keeping their families warm, happy, and properly fed. The main work of the village men was raising grain. It's not surprising, therefore, that most manors possessed their own mills for making flour. The laws governing the milling of grain are typical of a way a serf's life was regulated by the customs of the manor. A serf was required to pay to have his grain turned into flour at the lord's mill. Serfs caught grinding grain with their own hand mills were fined and their mills were destroyed. Serfs had to take their flour to the baker to be made into bread. Only one person was allowed to perform this skilled task here in the village bakehouse. The baker, like other craftsmen, was a free man and was not bound to the land like the lowly serfs. Many other laws shaped the life of a medieval peasant. Hunting in the Lord's forest was forbidden, for the Lord reserved the wild game for his family and friends alone. Serfs were not even allowed to hunt the doves which flew throughout their villages. Doves were considered the Lord's property, and every manor house had a nearby dovecot where these birds were raised for meat, eggs, and the fertilizer they created. It's easy to see why the often hungry serfs resorted to poaching game, the most common offense in the Middle Ages. Even rules governing the gathering of wood were very strict. Not one stick could be gathered before paying the Lord his annual wood penny, and even then only dead and fallen limbs could be taken. The lord of the manor also regulated the use of grazing land. Common land, the village green, was set aside for use by the serfs' animals. The lord and the church even managed to increase their wealth at the serf's expense upon his death. At this time, his heirs were required to give the lord his best animal as a death tax. And the church took his second best animal as a death gift, called a mortuary. Life on the medieval manor was not easy, but most serfs did not question their roles in society. There were pleasant times like Christmas when they received gifts from the Lord, and they were given feasts at harvest times. Medieval villagers, although very poor, also found pleasure in their families and friends. The church taught that poverty itself was noble, and no doubt most of them believed that the suffering they endured on earth would earn them a special place in heaven. By the 15th century, the sun had begun to set on the Middle Ages and its feudal way of life. Feudalism had arisen in response to warfare, which existed between many small kingdoms. But as the ever-growing web of feudal ties between nobles and their subjects began to link every aspect of medieval life, warfare gradually lessened, and society stabilized. People became increasingly bound to one another in ways which made war a less desirable way of solving problems than it had been in the past. And rule by law made peace a more realistic possibility. Throughout the land, nobles abandoned their castles or converted them into elegant palaces. And the Protestant Reformation altered forever the face of the church in England. More than 1/4 of the population fell to the Black Plague, creating a severe labor shortage. Now serfs could demand and get better living conditions, until finally serfdom disappeared in England altogether. As the cities began to grow, trade flourished, ending the isolation so characteristic of the feudal world. The vision of the people began to expand from the boundaries of their tiny villages to encompass the entire world, as explorers set sail on voyages of discovery. By the mid-1500s, a new interest in science and art began to grow as the Age of Rebirth or Renaissance dawned. And night fell forever on the medieval world.